This audio presentation of Hi Dad is brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction. Written by Herbert Ewing Duncan. Executive producers: Scottish Rite Grand Commander James D. Cole, 33rd degree. Grand Master of DeMolay John Sellars, and DeMolay Grand Secretary Stephen E. Crane. Narrated and produced by Matt Bowers, 32nd degree. Consulting producer Dean Alban, 33rd degree. Hi Dad book, copyright 1981. Audio recordings copyright 2023. All rights reserved. For information on how you can donate to support this audio serial, visit DeMolay.org. Chapter 2: The Formative Years. Midwest America in the first years of a new century was caught up in the potential changes and the high optimism of the time. The 20th century was believed to be the century of progress as the scars of the war between the states were healed and the western frontier grew into statehood. St. Louis was busy preparing for the World's Fair to be opened in 1904 to outshine the Pan American Exposition. Theodore Roosevelt had assumed the presidency following the assassination of William McKinley by a Polish anarchist on September 6, 1901, and was showing his big stick to the economy of the nation. There was a national pride in America and the anticipation that the future would be filled with years of continuing growth and unlimited opportunity. The land household was caught up in the events of the time. The economic fluctuations were such as to give brief periods of bright confidence that were followed by periods of recession and depression. William Land found it increasingly difficult to maintain a sound living standard as the lumber business reflected the uncertain economic conditions. Business worries and what, to him, was a complete lack of understanding at home led him increasingly to seek the friendly companionship of cronies at the neighborhood tavern. Here he could talk about real or imagined problems. To these friends he would say, "And there is my son. What's the matter with him? Frank is not like your sons. He reads all the time and, believe it or not, spends hours thinking. He is not like other boys. I can't understand him at all." But on many an evening as he left the tavern, he would find young Frank waiting outside to walk him home. The family misunderstandings and difficulties, small at first due to the pinch of finances, grew in magnitude with personality conflicts. The tensions mounted until there seemed to be only one solution possible: a separation. William chose to remain in St. Louis. Elizabeth accepted her mother's invitation to come home to Kansas City to share the white clapboard house at 3015 Grand. In the summer of 1902, she made the journey across the state with her two children, Frank, then 12 years old, and little Etta Glenn, known as Sissy, 7. The new home proved a haven of peace and understanding. The grandmother, Mrs. Martha J. Sampson, poured out her love in unlimited abundance to these three who were there to share her life for many years. Elizabeth Land had been reluctant to agree to this severance of family ties. She argued against it, but finally realized its wisdom, even though she felt it would be difficult for her children to adjust to a new home, a new city, and a new life. Frank especially found it difficult. He felt the loss of his father and the lack of a masculine personality in the home. He became increasingly shy. The love for his mother during these days deepened into a devotion that was to be an abiding influence all of his life. Sissy became his buddy, and his grandmother regarded him as her special joy and pride. But a boy in his teens needed a man to confide in, to share his problems, and to provide answers to the intriguing questions of life. This early need in his own life was to find expression in later years through the pouring out of his own understanding to the young men of the nation. In the autumn of that year, Sissy entered Hyde Park School while Frank enrolled in the Longfellow School. Both public schools had recently been built in what was then considered suburban locations, and each had an enrollment of just over 300 students. An old-time resident described these new schools by saying, "The changing skyline of the city as seen from the schoolroom windows has been a source of much interest in connection with the study of Kansas City's remarkable growth and development. It seems almost incredible that in so short a time in the immediate neighborhood, the busy hum of industries and the noise and hustle of traffic has taken the place of the lowing of cattle and the song of birds. These years were quiet years. Frank, still timid, was often reluctant to recite, and so shy that many times he walked all the way around the block to avoid the girls in his classroom. He filled his time by reading the youth books of the period, such as those written by George Alfred Henty and Horatio Alger. Other books that caught his attention stressed the importance of accepting individual responsibility. They pictured the hero as most important and offered the vision of a future of success coming to those whose character was based on honesty and initiative. Then there were long summer visits to the home of his Aunt Minnie, the wife of Dr. Frank Denslow, one of the most prominent physicians of the city and a man in whom he could confide. Two special interests now came into his life. One was the ambition to become a fireman like his friend, Emmett Scanlon, who gave him a fireman's cape and a red helmet. 2 or 3 times his fireman friends took him on terrific rides to fires in horse-drawn engines. The other interest came at dusk each evening. He would sit quietly on the porch of his home and wait for the lamplighter to come down the street, place his ladder against each pole, then insert a match in the long metal lighter and in one smooth motion turn on the gas and light the wick to illuminate the night. Frank partially remembered a poem from school that said the lamplighters were opening holes of light to penetrate the darkness. The days of the boy preacher were forgotten. He was invited to talk to Sunday school classes, but his efforts were not successful. Perhaps he needed his own basement, his own group, and the security of a united family. Graduation from the Longfellow School came in June of 1905. The commencement exercises of this elementary school were formal and quite elaborate, for school officials knew that this graduation would be the only one some of the students would ever experience. On the night of graduation, one of the boys serving as an usher recognized Frank's mother as she entered the auditorium and asked, "Are you the family of Frank Sherman Land?" So mother, sister, and grandmother were seated to watch their Frank go forward, when his name was called, to receive his diploma with its embossed seal and school colors of blue and white and ribbons tied around the certificate. In September, he enrolled for courses of study at Manual High School. His classes challenged him, and gradually self-confidence took the place of shyness, and he entered with enthusiasm into school activities. Boys of his age and older found him to be wise beyond his years. They came to him in increasing numbers with their problems, their questions regarding life, and to tell of their ambitions. They found him easy to talk to and appreciated his interest. There was a quality of wisdom about him that captured their attention, and the understanding radiating from the depth of his eyes instilled confidence. It was in the late spring of 1907, close to the completion of his sophomore year, that his grandmother, the great dominating personality of his life, gathered the family together one evening saying, "I wanted to have all of you together to talk about Frank's future. You all know he has 2 more years of high school, and then I pray that he will be able to go on to college. But as hard as we have tried and saved as much as we could, our money is not enough, and our prospects for more are not good." Frank listened as she told of her plan. She explained to the family that she wanted Frank to own something, to be a businessman. It was her opinion that some form of work after school hours and during the summer would give this to him and in addition help him earn enough for advanced schooling. "Now, grandmother," Frank interrupted, "I know you well enough to know that you already have a plan of action. What is it?" "I do have a plan," she replied. "You know our family in the past has had experience in the restaurant business. So, I suggest we all work together in a family restaurant. Your mother, you, and I will all be partners along with your aunt. I have found a vacant storeroom across from the car barns that will be ideal. There is one large room for our customers, a smaller room for the kitchen, and another room for an office. It is an ideal location and the rent is within our means. How does it strike you, Frank?" "It all sounds good, but I can't cook. What part do I take?" "Your mother and I will take care of the cooking. We will do all of it here at home and then carry it to the restaurant. It only is a few blocks away and the menu will be simple but ample. You will take charge." The rooms at 619 East 31st Street were rented and the bare minimum of equipment was purchased from pooled family goods. It proved to be a good location. Directly across the street was the Metropolitan Street Railway Company with a large number of employees. This old building had originally served as a car barn housing the horses of the horse-drawn streetcars, but as horses had been replaced, the building had been converted so that all could see through the huge circular brick openings, the great rotary converters that furnish power to the up-to-date transportation system of the city. Other businesses had moved to the neighborhood, and the Land Family Restaurant was an immediate success. A description of this business was given in later years by Sumner N. Blossom when he was a young reporter for the Kansas City Times. I was on assignment to pick up a daily feature of my own choice, something like the assignments of present-day columnists. I was looking about the streetcar barns at 31st and Holmes Street. Across on 31st, I noticed a small restaurant with a sign in the window which said, in effect, "All you can eat for a quarter." Inside was a circular counter. In the center was a man who I came to know as Frank. He had pots of beef stew, coffee, and sliced bread. There was no help. He served his customers, and he did everything himself. He told me that his grandmother, with whom he lived, prepared the stew either the previous evening or early in the morning. Simple as this operation seemed, it was tiring in the long hours and in the demands placed on his time and strength. As the beginning of the school year approached, Frank realized he could not carry a full course of studies under these conditions. Consequently, he enrolled for his junior high school year in only 2 subjects, English and business arithmetic. Even this was too much for him. He was often at the restaurant until 1 o'clock in the morning. It became such a battle to stay awake through the days that finally toward the close of the semester he withdrew from school. To Frank, always sensitive to the beautiful and possessed with a deep desire to be of service, the restaurant lacked the element of the creative. He had always liked to draw, and his family now urged him to continue his education with this new expression. So, in the spring of 1908, he enrolled in the newly formed Kansas City Art Institute. There the hours of attendance were more flexible and the courses more in harmony with his business hours. Here he found a fresh outlet for his imagination as he advanced from one medium to another to store up within himself a love and appreciation of all forms of art. It was there he met and fell in love with Nell. She was even more bashful and shy than Frank. With timidity she would watch this handsome young man with his deep blue eyes and hair that even in his late teens was showing a touch of gray. She found it increasingly desirable to accompany her older sister, Anne, to the Art Institute to watch, as an observer, the students respond to her sister's teaching. Both girls were exceptionally beautiful with black hair, the deepest of brown eyes, and the high coloring of their ancestral heritage of Central Europe. Often, when a model was needed to picture the Gibson girl made famous by James Montgomery Flagg, Anne would pose for her class. Frank was aware of Nell's beauty and of her charm, but he never thought of speaking to her or dared to show the slightest interest. One day during a class session, Nell rose from her chair to walk slowly around the room to watch each student at work on a still life given as the work for the evening. It was a rather stilted arrangement, composed of a Navajo rug in colors of gray, red, and yellow serving as a background for a Maria vase filled with stalks of ripened wheat and ears of vari-colored autumn corn. Each student, after careful study, began to sketch. Nell went to each easel to look, without comment, at the individual representation of the Indian composition until she stood in back of Frank to see his work. She was astonished. Frank had become disinterested in the class assignment and had become absorbed in his own idea of what he wanted to draw. "Mr. Land," she exclaimed, "for pity's sake, what are you painting? What are you doing?" Frank stopped his work, turned slowly as the color of embarrassment came over his face. Then he saw her really for the first time. She was dressed in a white blouse with a high collar. Deep pleats flowed from the neckline to the narrow waist. The sleeves, while tight at the wrists, gave way to a full puffed quality at the shoulders. She wore a narrow band of black ribbon at her throat and a slightly wider white ribbon in her jet black hair that had been carefully combed in a pompadour. Her skirt was full and made of dark wool with a peasant pattern at the hem in contrasting colors. It was daring in length as it fell to just the top of her trim shoes, not to the conventional floor length. Her presence so close to him and her interest in what he had been drawing took away his shyness, and he said, "I am painting a shield of chivalry." "Why?" "Because as I was coming to the studio this evening, I saw such an emblem, badly drawn, on the lid of a cigar box. I simply had to draw one that was correct." "And this one you are painting, is it correct?" "Of course it is. I have always been interested in the Crusades and the time of history when knights fought their battles and rescued fair ladies from danger. Now, the emblem I am drawing would be from the 14th century. It was then that swords were first placed in the back of a shield. It was the golden age of heraldry. I have added a helmet too. Did you know that as the helmet was only worn by knights, it could only be used on the coats of arms of knightly families? Do you like it?" "Very much indeed. But it will get you in trouble. My sister is looking at us. Our talking is disturbing the class." It was weeks later before Frank found the courage to invite her to meet him at the drugstore across from the studio for ice cream and to talk, he suggested, about shields and swords and the age of chivalry. Somehow this subject was never mentioned. Instead, Frank said, "I know your sister calls you Nell, but I do not know your last name or anything at all about you. Tell me about yourself." "All right. My full name is Nell Madeline Swizuski. My parents came from Poland to Kansas City just before I was born. To save you from asking, the date of my birth was February 5th, 1893. I have checked on you. I am 3 years younger." She continued, "My mother died when I was just an infant, so my aunt was called to leave her home in Europe and come to America to take care of me and my 2 sisters, Catherine Elizabeth and your art teacher, Anne. Your aunt must have been a wonderful person. She truly was a dear, sweet lady. In her homeland, she was recognized as an outstanding musician and at one time presented the Messiah in her village. She not only raised her 3 nieces, but she instilled a love of art and music in each of us. She gave piano lessons to me when I could scarcely reach the keyboard. I have not had time to learn much about music," said Frank. "Perhaps you could teach me. Do you play popular music?" "Hardly at all. I much prefer the classics. Beethoven is, I believe, my favorite." These two, who had each been longing so much for companionship, now found it quite natural to be together. Frank learned that at the death of her aunt, Nell had moved to the home of her sister, who had married and lived in a second-floor apartment on Independence Avenue in the northeast section of the city. Evenings were spent with Nell playing her piano and Frank telling of the books he was constantly reading to derive an education and to fill the void in his formal schooling. Later there were evenings at the Schubert Theater, the Orpheum, and the costume parties of the Beaux Arts Ball of the Art Institute. Frank had been so busy with the growth of the family restaurant and his romance with Nell that he had taken little notice of another romance in the Land household. His mother had met and fallen in love with a young grocery merchant, Leslie E. James. He was a handsome man, filled with determination to succeed, and just a year or so older than Elizabeth, who was then in the middle 30s of life. The romance grew into a bond that was to last in gracious beauty through the years. They were married in the First Methodist Church of Leavenworth, Kansas, on June 19, 1909. Some years later, a daughter was born, and Frank took pride in his little half-sister who had been christened Elizabeth Irene. He would carry her in his arms and call her his little Princess Irene. It was a name that seemed so appropriate that during the years her first name, Elizabeth, was forgotten and Irene became the name used in school and by the members of her family and friends. But his mother's marriage brought changes into Frank's life. First of all, he did not wish to go with his mother and her husband into a new home, and decided to remain in the old home with his grandmother. The restaurant that had served so well for the family now became complicated in ownership. It seemed best for this family enterprise to be under one ownership and to fulfill the dream of a business of his own. His grandmother agreed to sell her interest, as did his aunt, while his mother gave her share to him. Purchasing the business on less than a shoestring took all of his resources, and he found it necessary to ask his aunt for $10 for the cash register the first morning. But it was his, and at 18 he became the sole owner. Success came slowly, but within a short time, with his power of organization, The small restaurant became a gracious center of dining. It was remodeled, a cook, dishwasher, and waitress employed. This expansion brought the need for his continuous supervision, and he turned the small office of the restaurant into an apartment where he could live close to his business. Dad Land was to say in addressing a national group of youth advisors, "Look to the quiet lad for leadership. I have watched so many grow into the ability to inspire and to lead others. The boy who is too aggressive, too prone to force his way, often burns himself out before reaching his peak. Watch the quiet, sensitive, and conscientious young man who shies from a place of prominence at first, and then when the challenge comes, watch him. He will have the ability to lead. He will mature into a successful man. You will be proud of him." Frank Land would have vigorously denied it, but he was a perfect example of his own statement. He had been so shy, so drawn within himself, had given so much to achieve a self-inspired education during these early years that now, with the years of manhood just before him, he accepted the inherent challenge and began a life of leadership, a life dedicated to the service of people. For a period of a year, beginning in 1910, he took time from his business to work as a part-time substitute artist for the Kansas City Star. A.B. Chapin, then a cartoonist for the Star and one of Frank's teachers, found the opening in the art department for the paper for him. The job consisted mainly in making line drawings and sketches for advertisers. There was little pay, but, as he was to later brag a bit, it gave me the right to make technical claim to a brief career of professional artist in the varied pattern of my early life. A second impact of his art courses was the formation of the Municipal Art League. He was beginning to make friends of the prominent men of the city, and at lunch, one of the directors of the Art Institute said, "Frank, you are a dedicated young man. Why not do something to beautify the hometown? Look at it. Outsiders call it a cowtown grown up, and it is. Take a look at the cluttered streets and the hideous mass of overhanging signs. You could get a score of young fellows from the Art Institute and clean up the town." An organized battle to improve the beauty of his city began. It took all of his available hours, but the movement made an impression on the city. He enlisted not a score of the young leaders, but a group composed of over 300 enthusiastic art students. Cooperation was found with civic leaders and the Merchants Association. The movement was able to eliminate a large share of the objectionable signs, launched the first annual cleanup campaign, put flower boxes in some of the downtown windows, plant flowers and shrubs on former eyesore vacant lots, and install ornamental light standards on downtown streets. The Star, in commenting on this work, said in delightful understatement, "He made an impression." June 21st, 1911, was just an ordinary day in early summer until his entire family came to the restaurant singing "Happy Birthday" and piling gifts on the tables. There was no visible gift from Grandmother Sampson. "Frank," her comment was, "you are now 21 years old. I am proud of you and what you have done." Then handing him an envelope, she continued, "Your grandfather was a Mason. I would be happy if you joined the fraternity he loved. In his memory, and as a gift to you, you will find in this envelope the money necessary for you to present a petition for the degree of Masonry. Do as your heart directs, but it would please me so much to have you do this." Having now arrived at the acceptable age for membership in a Masonic lodge and with $50 to go with the petition, Frank waited for someone to ask him to join. When no one extended an invitation, his eagerness and deep desire led him to speak to two of his regular customers, asking what he had to do to have his name presented for membership. They were eager to help, and on April 25, 1912, his petition was received in Ivanhoe Lodge No. 446, Ancient Free and Accepted Masons, signed by Charles Homer Talbot and Clarence J. Trigg. He was initiated and entered apprentice on May 25, 1912, passed to the degree of Fellowcraft June 17, 1912, and raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason on June 29, 1912. He had brought reality to the dream of his grandmother, but there was more than the fulfillment of a dream. Masonry struck a responsive chord. It seemed to be something he had been unconsciously seeking. It provided a means of expressing his brotherly love, his compassion for those in trouble, and an outlet for his desire to help his fellow man. It was the sweet sound of distant trumpets that had been calling to him all of his life. He felt that he must enter into all of the Masonic groups to have their teachings, philosophy, and inspiration open wide their doors to him. In the incredible period of a few short months, he united with the York Rite and the Scottish Rite bodies and the Shrine. He joined Kansas City Chapter number 28, Royal Archmasons, receiving the Mark Master degree July 23, 1912, Past Master and Most Excellent Master degrees October 18, 1912, and the Royal Archmason degree October 25, 1912. The commandery orders were conferred by Kansas City Commandery number 10, Knights Templar with the Order of the Red Cross, November 21, 1912, Order of the Temple on December 19, 1912, and the Order of Knights of Malta, January 2, 1913. He became a 32nd degree member of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry for the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States of America in the November class of 1912 at Kansas City, Missouri. His interest was so great that he immediately started to work in the various degrees and committees in Scottish Rite Masonry. He was appointed to the line of officers of DeMolay Council of Caduce, becoming the presiding officer of that body as commander for the years of 1919 and 1920. On November 15, 1912, he was created a noble of the ancient Arabic nobles of the mystic shrine in Ararat Temple. He was to serve this temple as potentate in 1931 and was imperial potentate of the Imperial Council for North America in 1954. During the time that followed the days of the Art Institute, Frank had often called at the home of Nell Swazewski. The visits became increasingly frequent and each date more meaningful. He could talk with her as he could with no other. She found in him the answer to the questing of her soul. The romance between them deepened until their love found the sanctuary of marriage. The wedding service was in the home of Nell's sister on September 15, 1913. It was a quiet wedding with only a few present. Nell's matron of honor was her sister Anne. Sumner Blossom, who had been Frank's friend from the early days of the restaurant, served as the best man. William H. Skriner, pastor of the Bud Park Christian Church, led Frank and Nell in their wedding vow. In all the years, Frank never forgot this vow, nor did Nell. Their life became beautiful as they learned by loving and being loved, blessing and being blessed, to share the adventure of each day. A small apartment on Armour Street became their home. Frank would say, "We may have orange crates for chairs at first, but we will replace them one at a time. We must take pride in our possessions. We will do without until we can have just what we want. Most of all, Nell, you must be happy." Happiness was Nell's life. She would eagerly wait for Frank each night to come home and talk about the future they would share together. She had two pet names for him, Sock and Frankie. Her usual greeting to him would be, "Hi, Sock, what happened today?" Early in September of 1914, he had much to tell of what had happened. "Nell, I have an opportunity to sell the restaurant, lock, stock, and barrel. The offer is good, and if we sell, we will have a profit of over $8,000. How does it strike you? Shall we sell?" Nell did not hesitate. "Sell by all means." "But what will you do?" "You asked what happened today, and the offer to sell is only part of what happened. You know I have been serving as secretary of the Scottish Rite Employment Bureau, freely giving it as much time as possible. Well, this afternoon I was asked to give my full time to a continuation of this bureau to be known as the Masons Relief Committee with John H. Glazier as chairman. I would serve as administrator and secretary with an office in the Scottish Rite Temple. A lot happened today. What is your opinion about this?" Nell closed her eyes and seemed for an instant to be gazing beyond time. When she opened her eyes, she smiled and said with a voice of prophecy, "Frank, accept this offer. Take on this work. You will never be happy until you find a means of being of service to people. I believe this will open a new world for you. It is the threshold of your life's work. I feel that greatness for you and for others will come from this."